Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the glorious madness of historical dining, where our ancestors turned the simple act of eating into multi-hour theatrical productions that would make modern dinner theatre look like a drive-through experience. The epic saga of why people once needed an entire day to consume what we now inhale during a Netflix episode. So before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you're genuinely ready to question everything you thought you knew about mealtime efficiency. Drop a comment letting me know what you're snacking on while listening to this. The irony will be delicious. Now grab something comfortable to drink, maybe dim those lights, and let's journey back to when dinner wasn't just food, it was a full contact sport disguised as social etiquette. So, you think you could handle a medieval banquet? Precious. Really, like thinking you could survive a Jane Austen novel just because you've mastered ordering takeout. Picture this, you've just received an invitation to dinner. Not a casual, hey, wanna grab a bite? Text message that you answer while simultaneously scrolling through social media and wondering if you remembered to put on pants. No, this is a proper invitation. Parchment, wax seal, the works. The kind that arrives 3 weeks in advance because apparently, scheduling a meal in medieval times required the same level of coordination as launching a space mission. You unfurl this invitation, expecting to see something reasonable like dinner at 6, casual dress. Instead, you're greeted with the honor of your presence is requested for a feast commencing at the second bell, afternoon and concluding, God willing, and the wine cellar permitting. Sometime before the rooster's third crow. Translation: pack a sleeping bag and cancel your weekend plans. Welcome to the world of historical dining, where meals weren't just food consumption, but elaborate theatrical productions that made Broadway look like a casual Tuesday evening. These weren't dinners. They were endurance tests disguised as social events. The ancient Romans didn't just eat, they performed eating. The medieval nobility didn't simply dine. They orchestrated symphonies of gluttony that would make modern competitive eaters weep with envy and surrender. But why? Why did our ancestors turn the simple act of shoving nutrients into their face holes into multi-hour spectacles that required more planning than a military campaign? The answer, my chronologically advantaged friend, lies in a perfect storm of social hierarchy, limited entertainment options, religious obligations, and the fundamental human need to prove that you were better than everyone else through the medium of increasingly ridiculous food presentations. Let's start with the Romans, because they started everything, including the noble tradition of turning meals into weapons of social warfare. Roman dinner parties, or symposiums as they pretentiously called them, weren't just about food. They were about establishing your position in society through the careful deployment of exotic dishes, imported wine, and entertainment that ranged from poetry recitals to gladiatorial combat in your backyard. Yes, nothing says, I've made it, quite like having people fight to the death between the fish course and dessert. The typical Roman feast began around the 9th hour, which in their confusing numbering system meant mid-afternoon by our standards. But calling it the beginning is like calling the first raindrop the beginning of a hurricane. The actual meal was preceded by hours of preparation, not just in the kitchen, but in the social arena. Guests had to be carefully selected based on their social rank, their political alliances, and their ability to appreciate a good dormouse stuffed with honey and nuts. Yes, dormouse. The Romans ate dormouse. They considered them a delicacy. They bred them specifically for consumption, fattening them up in special jars until they reached peak squeakiness. If you think this sounds barbaric, wait until you hear about their fondness for flamingo tongues, peacock brains, and something called garum, which was essentially fermented fish sauce that smelled like death's armpit, but cost more than most people's houses. The host of a Roman feast faced pressures that would make modern wedding planners have nervous breakdowns. First, there was the question of the guest list. Invite too few people, and you looked poor or antisocial. Invite too many, and you risked running out of food, which was social suicide. Invite the wrong combination of people, and you might end up with a political scandal, a poisoning, or both. The Romans took their dinner party politics seriously. Then came the seating arrangement, which was more complex than solving a Rubik's Cube while blindfolded and being chased by wolves. Roman dining couches were arranged in a specific configuration called a triclinium, with 3 couches forming a U shape around a central table. But you couldn't just plop people down wherever they fit.
Oh no.
The position of each guest communicated their status, their relationship to the host, and sometimes their life expectancy if they happened to be dining with the emperor and had recently written unflattering poetry about him. The most honoured position was the consul's couch, located to the right of the host. This spot was reserved for the most important guest, usually someone with enough political power to have you executed if you served them inferior wine. The least honoured guests were stuck at the far end of the arrangement, close enough to see the good food, but far enough away that they got the dregs of everything. It was like being invited to a party and then being seated in the parking lot. But even before the guests arrived, the host had to deal with the kitchen situation, which was less cooking and more orchestrating a small war against ingredients. Roman feasts required armies of slaves, each with specialized roles that would make modern restaurant hierarchies look simple. There were slaves whose entire job was to taste food for poison. There were slaves who did nothing but arrange flowers. There were slaves whose sole responsibility was to ensure that the imported snow from the mountains didn't melt before it could be served with the wine. The Romans were obsessed with exotic ingredients, not because they necessarily tasted better, but because they were expensive and difficult to obtain. Why serve local fish when you could import something from the other side of the empire at 10 times the cost? Why offer regular wine when you could serve vintage Falernian that had been aged for decades and cost more than a small villa? The goal wasn't just to feed your guests, it was to financially intimidate them into submission. And the courses, sweet Jupiter's beard, the courses. A proper Roman feast didn't have 3 courses or even 5. They had as many courses as the host could afford, which for wealthy Romans meant somewhere between too many and dear gods, when will this end? The meal began with the gestatio or appetizers, which sounds innocent until you realize that Roman appetizers included things like pickled sea urchins, stuffed sows udders, and eggs from exotic birds that had to be transported hundreds of miles without refrigeration. The appetizers alone could last for hours, partly because there were so many of them, and partly because eating in ancient Rome was a performance art. You didn't just grab food and stuff it in your mouth like some kind of barbarian. You had to eat with the proper technique, using the correct fingers, making appropriate comments about the flavor and presentation, and engaging in witty conversation that demonstrated your education and sophistication. Speaking of technique, Romans ate with their hands, but this wasn't the casual food experience you might imagine. There were rules. Specific fingers for specific foods, proper ways to hold morsels, acceptable methods for cleaning your hands between courses, which happened frequently because Roman cuisine was apparently designed to be as messy as possible. Slaves stood by with bowls of perfumed water and towels, ready to help guests maintain their dignity while wrestling with honey glazed flamingo. After the appetizers came the prima mensa, or main course, which was where Roman chefs really showed off their creativity and their complete disregard for anyone's digestive comfort. This wasn't just about serving good food, it was about serving impossible food, dishes that required ingredients from 3 different continents, preparations that took days to complete, presentations that were more sculpture than sustenance. Roman chefs specialized in what could only be called culinary illusions. They would serve what appeared to be a roasted pig, but when you cut into it, you discover it was stuffed with live birds that would fly out in an explosion of feathers and panic. They created dishes that looked like one thing, but tasted like something completely different, using techniques that wouldn't be out of place in a modern molecular gastronomy restaurant. If modern molecular gastronomy restaurants were run by people with unlimited budgets and a concerning fascination with animal organs. One popular dish was called Trojan pig, which was a roasted pig stuffed with various other animals, which were in turn stuffed with smaller animals, creating a kind of Russian nesting doll of meat that took hours to properly serve and probably required an engineering degree to construct. The host would dramatically carve into the pig, revealing layer after layer of different meats. while guests applauded and pretended this was the most normal thing in the world. But the food was only part of the entertainment. Roman dinner parties featured live performances that would make modern dinner theatre look restrained. Musicians played throughout the meal. Poets recited epic verses between courses. Acrobats performed death, defying stunts while you tried to enjoy your stuffed dormouse. Some hosts even imported exotic animals for their guests' amusement, because nothing says elegant dining like having a leopard prowl around while you're trying to figure out which fork to use for the peacock brains. The entertainment could get competitive. Hosts tried to outdo each other with increasingly elaborate performances. One wealthy Roman famously had his servants dress as gods and goddesses and reenact scenes from mythology while serving food. Another hired philosophers to debate the meaning of existence while guests ate, which must have been delightful when you just wanted to enjoy your fermented fish sauce in peace. And then there was the wine. Romans didn't just drink wine. They studied it, analyzed it, and turned it into a subject of academic discourse that could consume hours of dinner conversation. They had wines from specific vineyards, aged for specific periods, mixed with specific proportions of water and spices. They had wine critics who could identify not just the vineyard, but the specific hillside where the grapes were grown. They had wine ceremonies that were more elaborate than modern wedding receptions. The wine service itself was a performance. Slaves didn't just pour wine, they presented it. They announced its origin, its age, its supposed health benefits. They mixed it with water in precise ratios, adding spices and honey according to traditional recipes that had been passed down through generations. Some wines were served hot, others cold. Some were mixed with snow from distant mountains, others were flavored with exotic herbs that cost more than most people's annual income. But Romans weren't content with just eating and drinking. They had to philosophize about it. Dinner conversation was expected to be intellectually stimulating, covering topics like politics, literature, philosophy, and the proper way to stuff a peacock. Guests were expected to contribute witty observations, clever wordplay, and profound insights about the nature of existence, all while navigating the social minefield of Roman politics and trying not to choke on their dormouse. The conversations could go on for hours, meandering through topics with the casual disregard for time that comes from having absolutely nothing else to do. Remember, this was before television, before books were widely available, before any form of entertainment that didn't involve live humans performing for your amusement. Dinner parties were not just social events, they were the primary form of intellectual and cultural exchange. As the evening progressed, the wine flowed more freely, the conversation became more animated, and the entertainment more risque. Roman dinner parties had a reputation for getting wild, and not just because of the alcohol. They were famous for their relaxed attitudes toward behavior that would scandalize modern dinner guests. But even their wildness was structured, governed by social rules and expectations that everyone understood. The meal would continue deep into the night, with course after course arriving in a seemingly endless procession. Guests would recline on their couches, occasionally getting up to vomit in specially provided basins, because Roman gastronomy was apparently designed to exceed human digestive capacity. This wasn't seen as disgusting, it was seen as practical. How else were you supposed to make room for the next 7 courses? Finally, as dawn approached, the secunda mensa or dessert course would arrive. But Roman desserts weren't the simple sweet treats you might expect. They were elaborate confections made with honey, nuts, exotic fruits, and spices imported from the far reaches of the empire. Some were shaped like architectural monuments. Others were designed to tell stories or commemorate historical events. One popular dessert was made to look like a miniature amphitheater, complete with gladiators made of marzipan fighting to the death while guests watched and ate the audience. By the time the last guest stumbled home, the sun was rising. Servants were collapsing from exhaustion, and the host was already planning the next feast, because in Roman society, your social standing depended on your ability to consistently throw dinner parties that left your guests financially intimidated, culturally overwhelmed, and physically incapacitated. But the Romans, excessive as they were just getting started. Fast forward a few centuries, and the medieval nobility had taken the concept of the elaborate meal and turned it into something that would make Roman feasts look like casual snacks. Medieval banquets weren't just meals, they were political statements, religious ceremonies, and social hierarchies made manifest through the medium of increasingly bizarre food presentations. If you thought Roman dormice were excessive, wait until you meet the medieval tradition of serving entire roasted peacocks with their feathers replaced after cooking, so they looked alive but tasted like poultry that had been tortured by a chef with delusions of grandeur. The medieval feast began with the ceremony of seating, which was more complex than modern diplomatic protocols and potentially more dangerous. The Great Hall wasn't just a dining room, it was a theatre where social rank was displayed through seating position, table height, and proximity to the salt cellar. Yes, the salt cellar. In medieval times, your relationship to the salt determined your social status. Sitting above the salt meant you were important. Sitting below the salt meant you were basically furniture with the ability to eat. The high table, where the lord and his most honoured guests sat, was literally higher than the other tables, positioned on a raised platform so that everyone in the hall could see and be reminded of their inferior social position. The lord sat in the centre, flanked by guests arranged in order of importance, wealth, and political usefulness. The further you sat from the lord, the less important you were, and the worse your food became. It was like a restaurant with a caste system. But before anyone could eat, there were rituals to observe that would make modern etiquette look casual. Hands had to be washed in a specific ceremony involving servants with ewers and towels. Prayers had to be said, not just one prayer, but multiple prayers for different aspects of the meal, the harvest, the Lord's health, and the general state of everyone's souls. Then there was the horn ceremony, where various horns were blown to announce different courses, creating a soundtrack that was part dinner bell, part medieval orchestra. The first course alone could take hours to serve and consume, not because there was necessarily a lot of food, but because medieval dining was performed at the speed of ceremony. Each dish had to be presented with appropriate fanfare. Servants didn't just bring food, they announced it, described it, and sometimes performed little ceremonies around it. The carving of meat was an art form that required years of training and involved more flourish than a Broadway musical. Medieval carvers were specialists who travelled from feast to feast, demonstrating their skill at reducing various animals to servable portions while performing knife tricks that would make modern hibachi chefs look restrained. They had specific techniques for different animals, traditional cuts that had been passed down through generations, and an entire vocabulary of carving terms that turned dinner into a technical demonstration. But the real-time consumer was the entertainment, which in medieval feasts wasn't just between courses but during courses, around courses, and sometimes instead of courses. Medieval lords competed to provide the most elaborate entertainment for their guests, not just because they wanted to be good hosts, but because their reputation and political standing depended on their ability to throw parties that left other nobles feeling inadequate. Musicians played throughout the meal, but not quietly in the background. Medieval feast music was loud, complex, and designed to be part of the experience. There were songs written specifically for different courses, traditional melodies that accompanied the presentation of specific dishes, and elaborate musical performances that told stories, celebrated victories, or mocked enemies who weren't present to defend themselves. Then there were the mystery plays, which were essentially dinner theatre performed by servants, travelling performers, or sometimes the guests themselves. These weren't short skits. They were full dramatic productions that could last for hours, telling religious stories, historical tales, or contemporary gossip turned into entertainment. The audience was expected to participate, comment, and sometimes join in, turning dinner into an interactive theatrical experience. Some medieval feasts featured elaborate pageantry that turned the Great Hall into a stage set. Servants would dress as characters from legends or history. The food would be presented as part of theatrical scenes. One famous medieval feast featured the story of the Trojan War, with different courses representing different episodes of the epic, served by actors in costume who performed scenes between the soup and the roasted swan. And speaking of roasted swan, medieval cuisine was obsessed with presentation, that prioritized visual impact over practical considerations like temperature or ease of eating. They served birds with their feathers restored, fish arranged to look like they were swimming, and elaborate dishes that were more art installation than food. The famous medieval cockentress was a creature made by sewing the front half of a pig to the back half of a chicken, creating a mythical beast that existed nowhere in nature, but looked impressive on a medieval table. These presentation dishes, called subtleties, were designed to amaze and confuse guests in equal measure. They were often mechanical, with moving parts operated by hidden servants. Some subtleties contained surprises that were revealed during carving, live birds that flew out when the pie was opened, hidden compartments filled with perfumed water, or smaller dishes nested inside larger ones like culinary Russian dolls. But the most time-consuming aspect of medieval feasts was their social function as networking events, marriage markets, and political conferences all rolled into one. Guests didn't just come to eat, they came to see and be seen, to make deals, arrange marriages, plot political alliances, and gather information about what their neighbors, allies, and enemies were up to. The seating arrangement was a complex negotiation that could take days to finalize, as the host tried to balance social rank, political alliances, family relationships, and the very real possibility that some guests might try to poison each other between courses. Medieval nobles were not known for their conflict resolution skills, and dinner parties sometimes turned into actual battles, with guests using the serving knives for purposes the kitchen staff never intended. Conversation at medieval feasts was a performance art that required extensive knowledge of court etiquette, political developments, religious doctrine, and the complex web of family relationships that connected every noble house to every other noble house through marriages, feuds, and mutual financial obligations. A single comment could start a war, end an alliance, or result in the speaker being invited to fewer dinner parties, which in medieval society was essentially social death. The wine service at medieval feasts was even more elaborate than Roman wine ceremonies, partly because medieval nobles had access to wines from all over Europe, and partly because they had turned wine appreciation into a competitive sport. Wine wasn't just tasted, it was analysed, discussed, and used as a topic of conversation that could consume hours of dinner discussion. Medieval wine servers were specialists who could identify wines by sight, smell, and taste, and who were expected to provide detailed information about each wine's origin, age, and supposed medicinal properties. Yes, medicinal properties. Medieval people believed that different wines could cure different ailments, balance bodily humours, and provide protection against various diseases. Wine service included medical consultations. But wine wasn't the only drink on offer. Medieval feasts featured an array of beverages that would challenge modern bartenders' mead made from honey and various herbs. Ales flavoured with everything from ginger to ground pearls, and elaborate mixed drinks that were more potion than beverage. Some of these drinks were served hot, others were mixed with spices, and a few were set on fire for dramatic effect, because medieval nobles apparently felt that regular alcohol wasn't dangerous enough. The courses themselves could number in the dozens, but medieval courses weren't like modern courses. Each course might contain multiple dishes, all served simultaneously, creating a buffet-style presentation that allowed guests to sample various options while engaging in the complex social negotiations that were the real purpose of the feast. Between courses, there were palate cleansers that were less about cleansing palates and more about providing opportunities for entertainment, conversation, and political maneuvering. Guests might be served exotic fruits while acrobats performed, or offered perfumed waters while poets recited verses written specifically for the occasion. These interludes could last longer than the actual eating, as guests used the breaks to move around the hall, change conversation partners, and engage in the kind of social networking that determined their future prospects. The medieval feast reached its climax with the presentation of the roasted peacock, which wasn't just a dish, but a ceremony that involved multiple servants, elaborate carving rituals, and a presentation that was designed to demonstrate the host's wealth, taste, and ability to obtain exotic ingredients. The peacock was usually stuffed with other birds, creating a nested meat experience that took considerable time to properly serve and even longer to politely consume. But even after the peacock, the feast continued with additional courses, entertainment, and the gradual transition from formal dinner to informal socializing that could last until dawn. Medieval nobles didn't have day jobs in the modern sense, so staying up all night at a feast wasn't a problem, it was a lifestyle. As the night progressed, the entertainment became more elaborate and the social interactions more complex. Marriage negotiations might be conducted over dessert. Political alliances could be formed during the cheese course. Business deals were struck while the minstrels played. The medieval feast was a multi-purpose social institution that served functions modern society distributes across multiple venues and occasions. The cleanup alone could take days, partly because medieval feasts generated enormous amounts of waste, and partly because every dish, every utensil, and every decorative element had to be properly maintained for the next feast. Medieval nobles were constantly either preparing for a feast, hosting a feast, or recovering from a feast, creating a social calendar that revolved around elaborate meal consumption. But medieval feasts, excessive as they were still constrained by the technology and ingredients available in their time. The real explosion in dining duration came during the Renaissance, when increased trade, improved preservation techniques, and the discovery of new continents provided European nobility with access to ingredients and preparation methods that turned meal planning into an exercise in international logistics. Renaissance feasts were the medieval banquet concept amplified by global trade networks, improved cooking techniques, and a competitive nobility that had turned elaborate dining into an art form that required teams of specialists to execute. These weren't just meals. They were multimedia experiences that combined food, art, music, theatre, and social networking into events that could last for days. The planning process alone could take months. Renaissance feast organizers had to coordinate with suppliers across multiple countries to obtain exotic ingredients. They had to hire teams of specialist chefs who could work with new ingredients from the Americas, artists who could create elaborate table decorations, musicians who could compose original pieces for specific courses, and logistical coordinators who could manage the complex timing required to serve multiple courses to hundreds of guests without everything turning into chaos. Renaissance cuisine incorporated ingredients that had never before been available to European cooks: tomatoes from the Americas, spices from the Far East, chocolate from Central America, and exotic fruits from tropical colonies. But Renaissance chefs didn't just incorporate these ingredients. They turned them into elaborate presentations that were designed to demonstrate the host's international connections and financial resources. A single Renaissance dish might include ingredients from 4 different continents, prepared using techniques borrowed from multiple culinary traditions, and presented in a manner that required specialized serving equipment imported from the other side of the world. The logistics alone were staggering. Modern restaurant supply chains look simple compared to the international coordination required to throw a proper Renaissance feast. But the real-time sink was the entertainment, which in Renaissance feasts had evolved into elaborate theatrical productions that made medieval mystery plays look like casual dinner conversation. Renaissance nobles competed to provide the most spectacular entertainment, hiring professional companies to create original productions specifically for their feasts. These weren't just plays performed during dinner, they were integrated experiences where the food, entertainment, and social interaction were all part of a single elaborate production. The courses were timed to coincide with specific scenes. The serving staff were costumed as characters from the performance. The dishes themselves were designed to relate to the dramatic themes, creating a unified artistic experience that required extensive rehearsal and precise coordination. Some Renaissance feasts featured live performances that lasted longer than the actual meal. There were elaborate masks where guests participated as characters in allegorical dramas. There were musical performances that told stories through multiple movements, with different courses served during different musical themes. There were art installations that were revealed throughout the evening, as servants removed covers from sculptures and paintings that had been created specifically for the feast. The famous Medici feasts in Florence were legendary for their integration of food and art. Guests might be served sculptures made of sugar that were too beautiful to eat, followed by paintings made of various foods that were too artistic to be considered mere sustenance. The line between meal and museum exhibition became so blurred that some guests reportedly spent more time admiring their food than eating it. But Renaissance feasts weren't just about conspicuous consumption, they were also about intellectual display. Renaissance nobles were expected to be educated, cultured, and capable of discussing art, literature, philosophy, and the latest scientific developments. Dinner conversation was an opportunity to demonstrate your knowledge, make witty observations about contemporary culture, and engage in the kind of intellectual sparring that could enhance your reputation or destroy your social standing. These conversations could go on for hours, covering topics that ranged from the latest philosophical treatises to the political implications of recent military campaigns in distant countries. Guests were expected to have opinions about everything and to express those opinions in a manner that demonstrated both knowledge and wit. The pressure to be constantly entertaining and intellectually stimulating turned dinner into a performance that required as much preparation as the food itself. The wine service at Renaissance feasts had evolved into something that would challenge modern sommeliers. Renaissance nobles had access to wines from all over Europe and beyond, and they had developed increasingly sophisticated methods for aging, blending, and serving different varieties. Wine wasn't just a beverage, it was a subject of academic study that could consume hours of dinner discussion. Renaissance wine ceremonies involved elaborate presentations where each wine was not just served but explained, analyzed, and discussed. Wine servers provided detailed histories of specific vineyards, technical explanations of production methods, and comparative analyses of different vintages. Some Renaissance feasts featured wine tastings that were essentially educational seminars disguised as beverage service. But wine wasn't the only beverage option. Renaissance feasts featured drinks that were more like liquid art installations, elaborate punches that included dozens of ingredients, flavored wines that had been infused with exotic herbs and spices, and theatrical beverages that changed color, produced smoke, or had other dramatic effects designed to amaze guests who thought they had seen everything. The course structure of Renaissance feasts had evolved beyond the medieval model into something that would challenge modern restaurant service. A single feast might include 20 or more courses, but each course could contain multiple dishes, creating a dining experience that was more like a food festival than a single meal. Guests weren't expected to eat everything. They were expected to sample strategically while engaging in social activities that were the real purpose of the gathering. Between courses, there were elaborate interludes that served multiple functions. They allowed the kitchen time to prepare the next course, gave guests opportunities to socialize with different groups, and provided entertainment that kept the energy high throughout the extended dining experience. These interludes might include live performances, art presentations, or social activities that were specifically designed for the feast. Some Renaissance feasts featured games and competitions that were integrated into the dining experience. There might be poetry contests where guests composed verses about specific dishes. There could be art competitions where guests created drawings or sculptures using food as materials. There were elaborate social games that required guests to interact with each other in specific ways, turning dinner into a kind of elaborate party game that lasted all night. The serving style at Renaissance feasts was itself a form of entertainment. Servants didn't just bring food, they performed choreographed presentations that were timed to coincide with musical cues. The carving of meats was performed like a dance, with multiple carvers working in coordination to create a visual spectacle while preparing the food for service. Some Renaissance dishes required live preparation that was performed in front of the guests. Flambeed desserts weren't just set on fire, they were ignited as part of elaborate fire shows that included choreographed movements and dramatic timing. Salads weren't just tossed, they were prepared through elaborate mixing ceremonies that were designed to be as entertaining as they were functional. The presentation dishes at Renaissance feasts had evolved beyond the medieval subtleties into elaborate art installations that challenged the definition of food. There were sculptures made entirely of edible materials that were too complex to be eaten. There were mechanical devices that moved and performed while serving food. There were optical illusions created with food that played tricks on guests' perceptions of what they were eating. One famous Renaissance feast featured a dessert that appeared to be a beautiful garden, complete with flowers, trees, and a flowing stream. Only when guests began to eat did they discover that everything was edible. The flowers were made of sugar, the trees were constructed from various pastries, and the stream was actually a flavored syrup that had been engineered to flow throughout the presentation. The entire garden could be consumed, but doing so destroyed a work of art that had taken weeks to create. But the most time-consuming aspect of Renaissance feasts was their social function as complex networking events where multiple agendas were pursued simultaneously. Guests weren't just there to eat, they were there to see art, hear music, engage in intellectual conversation, make political connections, arrange marriages, conduct business deals, and gather information about what everyone else was doing. The seating arrangements at Renaissance feasts required extensive diplomatic skills to navigate. Guests had to be positioned to facilitate productive conversations while avoiding potentially explosive conflicts. The host had to balance social rank, political alliances, business interests, family relationships, and the various personal feuds that made Renaissance social life resemble a soap opera with higher stakes and better costumes. Conversation topics had to be carefully managed to avoid sensitive subjects while providing enough intellectual stimulation to keep guests engaged. Renaissance nobles were expected to be knowledgeable about current events, artistic developments, scientific discoveries, and the complex web of international politics that connected every European court to every other European court through trade, marriage, and mutual suspicion. The dress code for Renaissance feasts was itself a form of competitive display that required extensive preparation and significant financial investment. Guests were expected to appear in clothing that demonstrated their wealth, taste, and awareness of current fashion trends. The clothing had to be appropriate for the specific feast, complement the intended entertainment, and send the right social signals about the wearer's status and intentions. Some Renaissance feasts had specific costume themes that required guests to dress as historical figures, mythological characters, or allegorical concepts. These themed feasts required even more preparation, as guests had to coordinate their costumes with the overall artistic concept while ensuring that their appearance enhanced, rather than detracted from their social standing. The aftermath of Renaissance feasts could be as complex as the events themselves. Thank you notes had to be written, social obligations had to be fulfilled, and the various connections made during the feast had to be followed up with appropriate social gestures. A single feast could generate weeks of subsequent social activity as guests worked to capitalize on the connections they had made and the impressions they had created. But Renaissance feasts, elaborate as they were still primarily European phenomena, limited by the cultural traditions and available resources of their time and place. The real explosion in dining duration and complexity came during the Baroque period, when European courts had developed the elaborate feast into a form of political theatre that required international coordination and budgets that revelled military campaigns. Baroque feasts were the Renaissance banquet concept amplified by absolute monarchy, international competition, and court cultures that had turned elaborate dining into a form of diplomatic warfare. These weren't just social events, they were political statements that communicated power, wealth, and cultural sophistication to guests who were often representatives of foreign courts. The Palace of Versailles under Louis XIV became the standard against which all other Baroque feasts were measured. Versailles feasts weren't just meals, they were elaborate productions that required months of planning, teams of international specialists, and budgets that could have funded small wars. Louis XIV didn't just entertain guests, he overwhelmed them with displays of French power, wealth, and cultural superiority that were designed to intimidate potential enemies and impress potential allies. The planning process for a major Versailles feast began months in advance and involved coordination between multiple government departments. The royal kitchens had to coordinate with diplomatic officials to ensure that the menu reflected appropriate political messages. The entertainment had to be designed to showcase French cultural achievements while subtly communicating political positions. Even the seating arrangements had diplomatic implications that could affect international relations. The kitchens at Versailles were essentially food factories that employed hundreds of specialists working in elaborate hierarchies that made modern restaurant brigades look simple. There were chefs who specialized in specific types of dishes, pastry specialists who created elaborate sugar sculptures, sauce experts who prepared dozens of different accompaniments, and presentation specialists who turned food into art installations. The logistics of serving a feast at Versailles required military precision. Food had to be prepared in kitchens that were located considerable distances from the dining halls, then transported while maintaining appropriate temperatures and presentations. The timing had to be coordinated so that multiple courses could be served simultaneously to hundreds of guests without everything turning into chaos. But the real complexity came from the integration of food service with elaborate entertainment programs that were designed to showcase French cultural superiority. Versailles' feasts featured original operas written specifically for the occasion, ballets performed by the finest dancers in Europe, and theatrical productions that communicated political messages through allegorical stories. The entertainment wasn't just performed for the guests, it was integrated into the dining experience so that the timing of courses coincided with specific scenes, the food presentations related to dramatic themes, and the overall experience told a coherent story about French power and cultural achievement. Guests weren't just watching entertainment, they were participating in elaborate political theatre. The famous feast given by Louis XIV for the Siamese ambassadors in 1686 lasted for 3 days and required the construction of temporary buildings to accommodate all the planned activities. The menu included dishes from around the world, prepared by chefs who had been imported specifically for the event. The entertainment featured performances that told the story of French exploration and trade, with different courses representing different regions of the French Empire. But Baroque feasts weren't limited to Versailles. Courts throughout Europe competed to create increasingly elaborate dining experiences that would demonstrate their wealth, power, and cultural sophistication. The imperial court in Vienna, the Spanish court in Madrid, and various German princely courts all developed their own versions of the elaborate feast, each with distinctive characteristics that reflected local traditions and resources. The Habsburg court in Vienna was famous for feasts that integrated food with elaborate musical performances. These weren't just dinner concerts. They were fully integrated experiences where the music was composed specifically to accompany different courses, and the food was designed to complement the musical themes. Some Viennese court feasts featured original symphonies that were performed in multiple movements throughout the evening, with different courses served during different musical sections. The Spanish court developed a tradition of feasts that showcased ingredients and culinary techniques from the Spanish Empire, creating international dining experiences that demonstrated the global reach of Spanish power. These feasts featured foods from the Americas, the Philippines, and other Spanish territories, prepared using techniques that had been developed specifically for court entertainment. German princely courts, competing with their larger neighbours, developed elaborate feast traditions that emphasized technical innovation and artistic presentation. German court chefs became famous for mechanical devices that served food, automated presentations that amazed guests, and technical innovations that pushed the boundaries of what was possible with available technology. But the most time-consuming aspect of Baroque feasts was their function as elaborate social and political institutions that served multiple purposes simultaneously. Guests weren't just there to eat and be entertained. They were there to participate in complex social rituals that reinforced political hierarchies, facilitated diplomatic negotiations, and demonstrated cultural values that were considered essential to civilized society. The etiquette requirements for Baroque feasts were so complex that they required extensive study and practice. Guests had to master elaborate protocols for greeting other guests, navigating seating arrangements, participating in conversations, and responding to entertainment. A single social mistake could have political consequences that affected international relations. The conversation requirements were particularly demanding. Baroque feast guests were expected to be knowledgeable about international politics, current military campaigns, recent artistic developments, scientific discoveries, and the complex web of dynastic relationships that connected every European royal house to every other royal house through marriages, treaties, and mutual obligations that went back generations. But conversation wasn't just about demonstrating knowledge. It was about demonstrating the right kind of knowledge in the right way at the right time. A comment that was witty in one context could be treasonous in another. An observation that showed impressive learning could also reveal dangerous political sympathies. Guests had to navigate conversational minefields while appearing relaxed, confident, and thoroughly entertained by the whole experience. The dress requirements for Baroque feasts had evolved into elaborate costume productions that required teams of specialists to execute. Guests didn't just wear clothing. They wore carefully constructed presentations of their social position, political allegiances, and cultural sophistication. The fabrics had to be appropriate to the season, the occasion, and the political message the wearer wanted to communicate. The accessories had to complement the overall presentation while demonstrating awareness of current fashion trends and international style developments. Some Baroque feasts required guests to change clothing multiple times throughout the evening, with different costumes for different courses or activities. These costume changes weren't just fashion statements, they were theatrical transformations that allowed guests to participate in the elaborate allegorical presentations that were integrated into the dining experience. The wine service at Baroque feasts had evolved beyond Renaissance complexity into elaborate ceremonies that resembled religious rituals more than beverage service. Wine wasn't just served, it was presented, explained, analyzed, blessed, and consumed according to protocols that had been developed over decades of competitive refinement. Baroque wine ceremonies featured multiple wine servers working in choreographed coordination, each responsible for specific aspects of the presentation. There were servers who specialized in opening bottles using techniques that had been elevated to performance art. There were specialists who mixed wines according to traditional recipes that were closely guarded court secrets. There were experts who could identify wines by sight and provide detailed histories of specific vineyards, vintages, and production techniques. But wine wasn't the only beverage option at Baroque feasts. Court beverage programs had expanded to include exotic drinks from around the world, tea ceremonies that had been adapted from Asian traditions, coffee presentations that showcased beans from various colonies, and elaborate punches that were more chemistry experiments than beverages. Some Baroque courts developed signature drinks that were served only at their feasts, created by court chemists who combined exotic ingredients according to secret recipes. These beverages weren't just drinks. They were liquid symbols of court power and sophistication that guests would remember and discuss for years after the feast. The course structure of Baroque feasts had evolved beyond the Renaissance model into something that challenged the very concept of a meal. A major Baroque feast might include 30 or more courses, but the definition of course had become so elastic that some courses consisted of single elaborate presentations, while others included dozens of different dishes served simultaneously. The famous feast given by Augustus the Strong of Saxony in 1719 reportedly included 47 courses served over a period of 14 hours, with entertainment programs that continued for 3 additional days. The menu included dishes from every region of Europe, prepared using techniques that had been developed specifically for the feast, and presented in ways that had never been attempted before. But the courses weren't just food presentations, they were components of elaborate theatrical productions that told stories, communicated political messages, and demonstrated the host's power to command resources from around the world. Each course was timed to coincide with specific entertainment programs, creating integrated experiences where food, music, theatre, and social interaction combined into single artistic statements. Between courses, there were interludes that served multiple functions while entertaining guests and providing time for kitchen preparations. These interludes might include live performances by internationally famous artists, presentations of new artistic works that had been commissioned specifically for the feast, or social activities that allowed guests to network with different groups while participating in elaborate court rituals. Some Baroque feasts featured gambling between courses, but this wasn't casual card playing. Court gambling was elaborate theatre, where the stakes were political as much as financial, and the games were designed to create opportunities for diplomatic negotiations, alliance building, and the kind of social maneuvering that determined international relationships. The serving style at Baroque feasts had evolved into choreographed performances that required extensive rehearsal and precise timing. Servants didn't just bring food. They performed elaborate ballets while serving, with movements that had been designed to complement the musical programs and enhance the overall theatrical presentation. Some Baroque courts employed serving staff who were also trained performers, capable of singing, dancing, and acting while serving food. These servant performers created integrated presentations where the service was as much a part of the entertainment as the food itself, blurring the lines between staff and cast in the elaborate productions that Baroque feasts had become. The presentation dishes at Baroque feasts pushed the boundaries of what could be considered food. Court chefs created edible architecture that reproduced famous buildings, edible landscapes that depicted famous battles, and edible portraits of royal family members that were too artistic to be consumed but too elaborate to be preserved. One famous Baroque feast featured a dessert presentation that reproduced the entire palace grounds in sugar, complete with working fountains, moving figures, and hidden mechanisms that created sounds and movements throughout the presentation. The dessert took weeks to create, and was so elaborate that guests spent more time admiring it than eating it, which was apparently the intended effect. But the most time-consuming aspect of Baroque feasts was their integration with complex political and social agendas that required careful coordination and extensive follow-up. These weren't just social events, they were diplomatic conferences, cultural exchanges, marriage markets, and political theatres rolled into single elaborate productions. The guest lists for major Baroque feasts required diplomatic clearance and could affect international relationships. Inviting the wrong combination of guests could create political incidents. Failing to invite important figures could be interpreted as political statements. The seating arrangements alone required weeks of negotiation between court officials and diplomatic representatives. But even after the feast ended, the political and social work continued. Thank you protocols had to be observed, diplomatic messages had to be sent, social obligations had to be fulfilled, and the various connections made during the feast had to be carefully cultivated through subsequent social activities. A single major Baroque feast could generate months of diplomatic and social activity as participants worked to capitalize on the connections they had made and the impressions they had created. The influence of Baroque feast culture extended far beyond the courts where these elaborate events took place. Wealthy merchants, successful professionals, and ambitious social climbers throughout Europe attempted to recreate scaled-down versions of court feast traditions, creating a culture of competitive dining that permeated all levels of society that could afford to participate. These non-court feasts couldn't match the scale or elaboration of royal entertainments, but they adopted the same principles: elaborate presentations, complex entertainment programs, extensive social rituals, and the integration of dining with other cultural and social activities. The result was a Europe-wide culture where elaborate dining had become a standard form of social expression for anyone with sufficient resources and ambition. But Baroque feast culture, elaborate as it was still limited by the technology, transportation, and communication systems of its time. The real explosion in dining complexity came during the 19th century, when industrial development, improved transportation, and global trade networks provided the wealthy classes with unprecedented access to ingredients, techniques, and cultural influences from around the world. Victorian dining culture took the Baroque feast tradition and amplified it with industrial efficiency, global ingredients, and social ambitions that turned elaborate dining into a competitive sport that consumed enormous amounts of time, money, and social energy. Victorian dinner parties weren't just meals, they were elaborate productions that required months of planning, teams of specialists, and social skills that had to be carefully cultivated through years of practice. The Victorian middle and upper classes had turned elaborate dining into a form of social warfare, where success was measured by your ability to intimidate guests with displays of wealth, sophistication, and cultural knowledge that demonstrated your fitness for membership in respectable society. These weren't just dinner parties, they were elaborate examinations where one social mistake could result in permanent exclusion from the circles that determined your family's future prospects. The planning process for a major Victorian dinner party began weeks in advance with the compilation of guest lists that required careful consideration of social rank, family relationships, political affiliations, religious beliefs, and the complex web of social obligations that governed Victorian society. The wrong combination of guests could create social disasters that would be remembered and discussed for years. Victorian hostesses were expected to master elaborate protocols for invitation writing, menu planning, table setting, entertainment programming, and conversation management that required extensive study and constant attention to changing social standards. The pressure to host successful dinner parties was so intense that some Victorian women reportedly suffered nervous breakdowns from the stress of managing their social obligations. The kitchen requirements for Victorian dinner parties had evolved into elaborate production systems that employed teams of specialists working in carefully organised hierarchies. Victorian kitchens weren't just food preparation areas, they were industrial facilities designed to produce elaborate presentations for demanding audiences who expected perfection in every detail. Victorian cooks had access to ingredients from around the world, thanks to improved transportation and global trade networks, but they were expected to use these ingredients in ways that demonstrated both creativity and respectability. Victorian cuisine was simultaneously adventurous and conservative, incorporating exotic ingredients while maintaining traditional presentations that communicated appropriate social values. The core structure of Victorian dinner parties had evolved into elaborate progressions that could include a dozen or more courses, each with specific social functions and presentation requirements. Victorian dinner courses weren't just food service, they were opportunities for hosts to demonstrate their knowledge of appropriate social forms while providing guests with chances to display their own cultural sophistication. A typical Victorian dinner party began with elaborate reception rituals where guests were greeted according to strict protocols that reflected their social rank and relationship to the host. These greeting ceremonies could take considerable time, as each guest had to be received individually with appropriate recognition of their status and position. The seating process alone could consume significant time, as Victorian dinner party seating arrangements were complex social statements that required careful negotiation of rank, age, gender, marital status, and family relationships. Victorian etiquette books devoted entire chapters to the proper methods for determining seating arrangements that would honour all guests appropriately while avoiding social conflicts. Once seated, guests were expected to participate in elaborate conversation protocols that demonstrated their education, refinement, and awareness of appropriate social topics. Victorian dinner party conversation was a performance art that required extensive knowledge of current events, cultural developments, and the complex social codes that governed polite society. But Victorian dinner parties weren't just about food and conversation. They were multimedia experiences that integrated dining with music, literature, and other cultural activities. Many Victorian dinner parties featured musical performances between courses, readings from contemporary literature, or discussions of artistic and intellectual topics that were considered appropriate for educated society. The entertainment programs at Victorian dinner parties could be as elaborate as the food service, featuring professional musicians, accomplished amateur performers, or carefully orchestrated group activities that allowed guests to display their cultural accomplishments while participating in appropriate social bonding. Some Victorian dinner parties featured elaborate games and activities that were designed to facilitate social interaction while demonstrating the participants' wit, knowledge, and social skills. These activities weren't just entertainment. They were opportunities for guests to enhance their social standing through displays of appropriate accomplishments. The wine service at Victorian dinner parties had evolved into elaborate ceremonies that demonstrated the host's sophistication while providing opportunities for guests to display their own knowledge of appropriate social forms. Victorian wine protocols were complex social rituals that required extensive knowledge of etiquette, tradition, and the proper ways to appreciate and discuss different varieties. Victorian wine cellars were carefully curated collections that reflected the owner's wealth, taste, and social connections. The selection of wines for a dinner party was a social statement that communicated messages about the host's status, values, and expectations for the evening's social interactions. But wine wasn't the only beverage option at Victorian dinner parties. Victorian beverage culture had expanded to include elaborate tea ceremonies, coffee presentations, and mixed drinks that were designed to complement specific courses while providing additional opportunities for social interaction and cultural display. The serving style at Victorian dinner parties required teams of trained servants who could execute complex service protocols without disrupting the social interactions that were the real purpose of the gathering. Victorian service was theatre performed by invisible actors who had to anticipate needs, maintain appropriate presentations, and facilitate social activities while remaining essentially unnoticed. Victorian servants were trained in elaborate protocols for food presentation, table maintenance, and guest service that required months of instruction and years of experience to master. The quality of service was a direct reflection of the host's social status and management abilities, creating pressure for perfection that affected everyone involved in the dinner party production. The presentation standards for Victorian dinner parties were extremely demanding, requiring elaborate table settings, floral arrangements, and decorative elements that communicated appropriate messages about the host's taste, wealth, and social position. Victorian dinner tables weren't just functional surfaces, they were artistic presentations that required considerable skill and expense to execute properly. Victorian table settings involved elaborate arrangements of china, crystal, silver, and linens that had to be coordinated to create unified presentations while accommodating the service requirements for multiple courses. The selection and arrangement of these elements required extensive knowledge of appropriate social forms and considerable financial investment in quality materials. But the most time-consuming aspect of Victorian dinner parties was their function as complex social institutions where multiple agendas were pursued simultaneously. Guests weren't just there to eat and socialize, they were there to participate in elaborate networking activities that could determine their families' future prospects in respectable society. Victorian dinner parties served as marriage markets, where eligible young people could meet appropriate partners under carefully controlled circumstances. They functioned as business networking events where professional and commercial connections could be made through appropriate social introductions. They provided opportunities for cultural and intellectual exchange that could enhance participants' social standing and educational development. The social obligations generated by Victorian dinner parties could extend for months after the actual events. Thank you notes had to be written according to strict protocols. Return invitations had to be issued in appropriate timeframes. Social connections made during dinner parties had to be carefully cultivated through subsequent social activities that maintained and strengthened the relationships that had been established. Victorian society had created a culture where elaborate dining was not just entertainment, but a necessary social skill that determined access to respectable society. Families invested considerable time, money, and energy in mastering the complex protocols required for successful participation in this culture, creating social pressures that affected every aspect of daily life. But Victorian dining culture, elaborate as it was still primarily a European and American phenomenon that reflected the values and resources of industrial society. The tradition of elaborate dining as social theatre reached its ultimate expression in the early 20th century, when wealthy international society had turned dinner parties into elaborate competitions that required international coordination and budgets that rivaled government expenditures. The Gilded Age dinner parties of wealthy Americans like the Astors, Vanderbilts, and other industrial titans represented the culmination of centuries of competitive dining culture. These weren't just social events. They were elaborate productions that required teams of international specialists, months of planning, and financial resources that exceeded the annual budgets of small nations. The famous dinner parties hosted by Mrs. William Backhouse Astor Gina at her Fifth Avenue mansion required months of preparation and employed hundreds of specialists working in carefully coordinated teams. The guest lists were compiled through extensive social research that considered not just the social rank and appropriateness of potential invitees, but their entertainment value, conversational abilities, and potential contribution to the overall success of the event. The menu planning for these elaborate dinner parties required consultation with internationally famous chefs, coordination with suppliers from around the world, and the development of original dishes that would demonstrate the host's creativity and resources while providing guests with experiences they could not obtain elsewhere. The entertainment programs for Gilded Age dinner parties featured internationally famous performers, original artistic works created specifically for individual events, and elaborate productions that integrated dining with theatre, music, and other cultural activities in ways that had never been attempted before. But even these elaborate American dinner parties were surpassed by the international society gatherings that took place at European spas, resorts, and private estates where wealthy individuals from around the world gathered for social seasons that lasted for months and featured continuous elaborate dining experiences that blurred the lines between individual dinner parties and extended cultural festivals. These international society gatherings represented the ultimate evolution of elaborate dining culture, where the simple act of consuming food had been transformed into complex cultural institutions that served multiple social, political, and economic functions while providing entertainment that could not be obtained through any other means. But this elaborate dining culture began to decline during the 20th century as changing social values, economic pressures, and technological developments provided people with alternative forms of entertainment and social interaction that were more efficient and less demanding than the elaborate dinner party traditions that had dominated wealthy society for centuries. The two world wars disrupted the social structures that had supported elaborate dining culture, while changing economic conditions made the enormous expenses required for competitive dinner parties less feasible for all but the wealthiest individuals. The development of new forms of entertainment like movies, radio, and television provided alternatives that were more accessible and less socially demanding than elaborate dinner parties. Modern dining culture has retained some elements of historical feast traditions, but the elaborate multi-hour dinner parties that once dominated wealthy society have largely disappeared, replaced by more casual forms of entertainment that reflect contemporary values and lifestyles. The simple act of sharing a meal, which our ancestors had transformed into elaborate cultural institutions, has returned to something closer to its basic function as social bonding and nutritional necessity. But the historical tradition of elaborate dining serves as a fascinating window into the social values, economic structures, and cultural priorities of past societies. The fact that people once routinely spent entire days consuming elaborate meals tells us something important about their relationship to time, social hierarchy, and the role of display in maintaining political and social structures. Perhaps most importantly, the historical tradition of elaborate dining demonstrates the human capacity for transforming basic biological necessities into complex cultural institutions that serve multiple social functions while providing entertainment, education, and social bonding that cannot be obtained through simpler means. The next time you find yourself complaining about a restaurant that takes too long to serve your meal, remember that you are participating in a cultural tradition that once required guests to commit entire days to the consumption of single meals, and that our ancestors found these experiences not just tolerable, but essential to their social, political, and cultural lives. In a world where we can obtain almost any food we desire within minutes through various delivery services, the idea of spending hours consuming a single meal might seem incomprehensible. But our ancestors understood something about the relationship between time, attention, and social bonding that we might have lost in our rush toward efficiency and convenience. The elaborate dining traditions of the past required participants to slow down, pay attention, and invest significant time and energy in social relationships that were maintained and strengthened through shared experiences that could not be rushed or simplified without losing their essential character. Whether this represents a loss of valuable social traditions or a liberation from unnecessarily complicated social obligations probably depends on your perspective on the relationship between efficiency and meaning in human social life. But there is no question that the transformation of simple meal consumption into elaborate cultural institutions represents one of humanity's most creative and persistent attempts to use basic biological necessities as foundations for complex social, political, and artistic expressions that enriched the lives of participants while serving important social functions that extended far beyond simple nutrition. The legacy of this elaborate dining tradition continues to influence contemporary culture in ways that we might not always recognize. From the formal dinner parties that still mark important celebrations to the elaborate presentations that characterize high-end restaurant culture to the social rituals that surround holiday meals and other special occasions. Understanding the historical development of elaborate dining culture provides valuable perspective on contemporary food culture and reminds us that the simple act of sharing a meal has served as a foundation for some of humanity's most sophisticated cultural achievements, even when those achievements required participants to spend entire days consuming what we would now consider single meals. And so concludes our journey through the elaborate dining traditions of the past, where meals were not just nutritional necessities, but complex cultural institutions that required days to consume and months to plan, serving social, political, and artistic functions that transformed simple food consumption into some of the most sophisticated entertainment experiences available to their participants. The next time you find yourself rushing through a meal while checking your phone and planning your next activity, you might spare a thought for your ancestors, who understood that sometimes the most important things in life are worth taking time to do properly, even if properly means spending an entire day doing something that could technically be accomplished in 20 minutes. Whether we should envy them their leisurely approach to dining or pity them for their inability to grab a quick bite and move on to more important activities is a question that each of us will have to answer for ourselves, based on our own values regarding the relationship between efficiency and meaning in human social life.